Since 1972, Morphosis has elaborated its own very style, from some ideas related to deconstruction, moving towards synthesis, always focused on the complexity of form and how it articulates with day-to-day life. Founder Thom Mayne has been a reference and an inspiration for generations of architects, and it will be for architects to come for sure. His always evolving interests had led Morphosis towards never-seen versatile architectural organizations and environments. Today, we have the chance to hear to Morphosis partner architect Arne Emerson. Since joining Morphosis in 2009, Arne has played a significant role in the design and development of a broad range of national and international buildings, competitions, and planning projects in the US, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Arne served as project architect on the Perot Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, Texas, and is currently serving as design partner for 2 new US embassies in Beirut, Lebanon, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The new headquarters for ENI in San Donato, Italy, a new arts district at the University of Texas at Dallas, and the new headquarters for Lululemon in Vancouver, British Columbia. Arne is one of 4 partners leading all aspects of the design direction of Morphosis. In addition to his professional career, Arne is a committed educator and lecturer. He is a frequent lecturer and guest professor at Montana State University, the Young Architects Academy in Italy, and as a studio critic at Washington University in St. Louis. He recently served on the President's Committee for Art and Architecture at Montana State University. So I welcome you and thank you very much, Arne, for doing this presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak about our work. It's always very exciting. And even though I haven't been to South America, it's very exciting for me to at least address the audience in Buenos Aires, which is an amazing city, an amazing country, and really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit of our work and really focus on public space, shaping public space. And there's a series of case studies that I will take you through all the way from North America to Asia, to the Middle East, and to Europe, and really to give you a sense for how we think about cities, how we think about space, how we think about architecture, and how that connects to cities. Public space is among the most defining elements of really any city, expanding beyond the notion of grand plazas and civic parks. And public spaces should really be understood as the broader network of open spaces, sidewalks and streets and corners and destinations throughout any city that people flow through and visit as they go about their daily lives. Even shops, museums, religious places, cafes, other places serving the public, really anywhere within a city can really be seen as an extension of public space. And public space is really more than a place where people interact with each other. It's really where the notion and character of a community is formed, right? It's the kind of cultural heart. So I really believe, and we believe, that public spaces shape cities. Public space should not be considered an urban planning concern, but an architectural one as well. Each building in every city represents an opportunity to connect to and augment the network of public spaces. Architects and urban planners must always work in tandem and work together to create spaces that are not only functional, but also enhance the social and cultural fabric of every city, right? This is the most important for that. And for example, as Buenos Aires or many South American cities, or for that matter, any cities that are around the world that are entering these new stages of growth, right? We're way into the 21st century and larger populations are starting to move into urban centers and urban cities. There's a great opportunity that exists to redefine the approach to public space and the way that it shapes the community as well. So public space should not just be considered an urban planning concern, but an architectural one. Each development throughout every city represents an opportunity to connect and augment the network of this space. We can do this through human-centered design, through accessibility, universal accessibility, of course, with sustainability, creating resilient environments and communities, and the cultural context. And so today, I want to share our various approaches at Morphosis and how we shape public spaces at the level of a single site and a building through a series of case studies of our recent work. It really encompasses a diverse range of planning and architecture, which is all united by an attention to shaping public spaces and environments in a way that integrates culture, community, connectivity, and performance. Our office is headquartered in Los Angeles. We have offices and studios as well in New York, Dubai, Seoul, and Shanghai. There's about a little less than 100 of us working worldwide, all sharing the same common vision and path of creating great spaces. And our work, of course, started out early on with some of the earliest works of understanding architecture, landscape, performance, and community. This happens to be Diamond Ranch High School in East Los Angeles, for example. And it was really starting to focus on public space and how outdoor spaces can really start to shape the function and the flow and the community of an educational space. As we started to move the work, getting into larger spaces and larger buildings, this is a San Francisco Federal building, and really starting to understand how civic buildings and civic spaces can really start to add back to communities as well, looking at more than just a building itself, but actually how civic spaces can really start to transform. And even whether for better or for worse in the more polarized environment that we live in now, you're starting to see protests that are happening around cities. And oftentimes these protests that are happening, whether it's in North America, Buenos Aires, Europe, Asia, wherever that is, oftentimes it's these civic spaces, these public spaces where these protests happen, which is really important. That's important to understand that these buildings and these spaces really contribute to different parts of the city. And really starting to look at the buildings and how even private buildings sometimes can start to extend to and become a part of the city and the urban fabric, whether that's bringing in the urban fabric inside into a building or an atrium or vice versa. It's really about how we can start to connect and shape these spaces to become part of that and really become a catalyst for development and growth for other buildings that are surrounding and for future growth and community that happens throughout a city's life. It's really about that activation, that idea of how can we start to think about buildings more than just four walls and a roof? How can we really start to think about creating shapes, creating spaces, and creating these kind of porous ideas and these notions that buildings can and should connect back to their community. So I'm going to take you through a series of case studies, starting to represent what I was just talking about. First, I'm going to take you to Italy. This is in San Donato Milanese, which is just outside of Milan. This is the E&I headquarters. We won a competition for about a decade ago. This was for a new headquarters for the largest oil and gas company in Italy for about 4,000 people. It was located on approximately 20 acres, approximately 80,000 square meters. And really, the idea was quite simple when we were entering into the competition, was thinking about the traditional Italian piazza. How can we start to use the notion of public space, but yet start to augment that into a private headquarters and office building and campus? So something that very much works for the 4,000 people that will live and work there, but then also how can this headquarters campus then connect back to the community as well? So really this kind of very simple notion of how do you take the idea of an Italian piazza? And so what we did is we started out with this 20+ acre site, not with putting buildings in the center, but starting out with the piazza in the center and how those buildings can start to wrap around that and start to define that and how they can start to shape that. And here we had a series of axes, where it was north, south, and east, west, that were very strong within the community and very strong within the city. So in addition to the piazza that's in the middle, we really wanted to reinforce a series of these urban axes, not only visually, but then physically as well. And so seeing a little bit more in terms of how that plaza, how that piazza can really start to open up then and connect to, and how these urban axes can connect, you start to see how the buildings open up, how they start to form and shape the plaza, how they start to form and shape these kind of exterior spaces, and ultimately how that then connects back to the city. And now each one of these moves, whether it's the orientation, whether it's the location, or whether it's the piazza that's in the middle, how that starts to become this kind of exterior space in a way. And this is more than just a piazza. If you are in more the traditional Italian piazzas, or Spain, or even France, really these exterior spaces are like buildings in themselves, right? They're not just a void space, but they're actually shaped by the buildings around them. They're shaped by the spaces, by the forms, by the material, by the lighting, by everything that's shaped around them, which ultimately starts to shape space. And each one of these starts to very quickly represent the understanding of how these office buildings are quite simple in terms of their layout, their form, their approach, and their width. So they serve their function in terms of accessing daylight, performance, flexibility, and day-to-day activity, and how to really kind of reimagine what a 21st century office campus can be. It's more than just putting people in high-rise buildings. It's really kind of rethinking how can we start to strategize and rethink and reshift the paradigm of how office buildings now post-pandemic can really start to contribute to a great office culture. And this was something that happened in 2011 and 2012. So the way that we were really starting to think about this is not only the flexibility of the office space itself, but then how can this building start to contribute back to the community? So you start to see how the buildings open up, how they start to lay back, and how the porosity of each building starts to open up into the community itself. So it's not just a kind of solid mass that's there, but instead it really starts to become this connected tissue that relates back to the surroundings and the context. So opening up, giving views through not only the complex itself, but looking at some of these other urban buildings that are located in there with as well. Of course, thinking about the pedestrian street life, the scale of that, how can we connect using landscape? How can we start to use that again to connect back to the city and create community? This happens to be where we have an existing 1950s building that we needed to salvage some of this. So this idea of new and old coming together. So everything in white is this kind of modernist Italian building that we salvaged. And that historic kind of adaptive reuse started to become a part of this integral arrival and entry sequence into the building. So this becomes this kind of quasi public space that allows people to come in, but yet we still have a secure barrier as well. So this kind of notion of in-between space starting to become a part of the community itself. And then once you get into the heart of the piazza itself, where the people are, this public space, each building has its own entry. It has landscaping. We have water gardens. We have lighting. We have different varying views. We have landscape gardens that are up above. So this really kind of multi-layered idea of this exterior space again, and how landscape, architecture, and all these different elements can start to come together to really create a very unique space where people can, like I said, there's working here, people coming here all hours of the day. People can have different spaces for meetings, formal meetings, informal meetings, coming outside to having meetings. And a lot of the ground floor spaces are really programmed to have spaces that can activate and connect this. So for example, cafes, fitness, conference centers, meeting rooms, things like that, that can really start to contribute to that overall day-to-day community that you start to get within an overall campus of, quite large, of 4,000 people that are living and working there every day. And each one of these buildings, even though they're separate, they are all connected by a series of bridges. So we have 3 separate buildings, but then you start to see here these kind of bridges that are up high, or these low bridges start to become these pedestrian connections that really start to enhance and connect each building. So there's a series of connectivity between each one, but yet you get this sense of kind of relief or open space when you start to go between one building and the other. Each one representing its own identity in terms of its entry and its entry sequence, and having a nice canopy that's landscaped with greenery and community and benches outside. Of course, with all the buildings, whether it's with a campus like this or whether it's a building within a campus, the importance of connecting an interior to an exterior is something that we've always been concerned with, and always something that we've focused on, is how can buildings start to really connect to their exterior. So instead of just walking through a door and forgetting where you were, there's always this notion of how do we connect not only visually, but physically. So whether that's using glass or windows or apertures, or for example, using materiality. but always trying to ensure that we have this connectivity between interior and exterior, and making sure that that connectivity is always there. As we move on to the US, this is in Southern California. This is in Costa Mesa, California, in Orange County. This is the Orange County Museum of Art that opened fairly recently, about a year and a half ago. This is a much smaller building. This is only about 5,500 square meters, so quite small. This is a contemporary art museum that was founded back in the 1960s. And it's really the last site that's on a cultural master plan that we were opportunistic enough to have as the last piece. And so what you see here in terms of the context, the orange is a cultural plaza, and the buildings that are surrounding that are performing arts buildings and different things. And we were really the last piece and the last site that we needed to connect to. So the importance of this was something that was really strong. It's bounded by an edge of the Avenue of Arts, so it really has a strong frontage, but it's also connected to the strong arts plaza that's here as well. So this is active during the day, at night, on weekends, and during weekdays, whether there's events or whatever that is, there's always something that's going on here. So our understanding and our approach of how can we really make this a building that starts to connect to the plaza itself. So the notion of not only just a building being a building, but how can it connect? We propose really this kind of bigger idea of how can we connect the roofscape? So one of the existing conditions that we had was a Richard Serra sculpture that was already there. And it was something that we really needed to respond to, not only within the plaza, but itself. So the building actually kind of starts to move back and represent and give space to this beautiful Serra sculpture. But then also, how could we start to take this energy from this cultural plaza, and very similar to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a series of steps, these kind of civic stairs that take you up from the plaza and then up into this kind of upper roof plaza, which originally this roof plaza was not part of the program. It was not part of the brief, but we proposed that it was essentially kind of a free space or something that was an addition that would not only allow people to come out and experience the city and the plaza in a different way, but then also give the museum a space for public events, for private events, for sculpture, and for art, and just a place for relaxing. Here we see this kind of notion or this idea of how the buildings start to kind of set back and give deference to the Richard Serra sculpture, but then also how the building starts to really kind of seamlessly interweave into this overall kind of like cultural landscape here with these buildings, and really kind of providing a backdrop building, if you will, being a little bit more quiet and humble, but also trying to make a series of kind of very distinct moves that start to connect to. So whether that's during the day, whether that's at night, the building really starts to open up as much as possible. I think one of the most important things that we had done here with a lot of museums, oftentimes we have to enclose everything with solid walls, but we really pushed the idea to kind of try to innovate and have some galleries that could open up to the city. So what you see down below is a series of kind of colored ribbons right along the sidewalk and the walking path. That's really the idea of this kind of urban gallery. So during the day, they completely open that up. So when you're walking by, it gives you this notion of this identity that there's something unique happening in here, that there's art in here. So it gives you this understanding that this is something more than just another building. It's actually a cultural institution. So this idea of really kind of community, again, and connecting back to, so having a day-to-day space for people to come hang out, patrons to come sit downstairs, down below, and really the idea that the building is starting to open up and kind of frame its surroundings with landscape, with plaza, with art. And of course, on any given day, on a weekend, it just happens to be an incredibly active and public space. And whether that's the Richard Serra sculpture that's there, whether there's another event that's happening across the way at one of the performance halls, or whether that's something that's happening in the museum, it really starts to kind of open itself up and start to become connected to and become a part of the overall cultural complex. And really, again, this idea, this notion of how do buildings then connect back to their interior, to their exterior? How do you create spaces that make a building feel like it's warm, it's welcome, it's opening, and something that gives you this kind of didactic understanding of what's happening inside the building? So this constant connectivity when you come in, and one of the most interesting parts about this is really this kind of atrium lobby space that starts to give you an understanding of how the building works, and how it functions. So right at the main entry, you get this immediate moment of verticality and compression happening at the same time. So we've got quite low spaces that are in here that connect you back to the galleries, but then as you're looking up, you start to see how this kind of vertical atrium and these stairs that become the kind of vertical circulation aspect, but then also gives you a great understanding of how light's coming in, how the building is used, and really just this kind of beautiful sculptural space that is also very pragmatic and also very functional as well. So it's allowing light in, it's working for circulation, it's taking people to and from different places where they want to go. So really this kind of dynamic, activated space that allows people to really interact. So the kind of front of house space becomes a piece of artwork in itself before people are even entering into the galleries. And again, as we start to step back out into one of the galleries that opens up to the street level itself, this is really something that can start to become an exhibition that changes over time. It's meant to be a little bit more functional and varied. So whatever that is, if it's a little bit less sensitive to light or art, it really starts to become this window into this institution, this kind of window that says, there's artwork here, there's something important that's happening here. And really that idea of, again, kind of creating that space and creating that kind of narrative and that open space of how these buildings can start to connect back to their communities. So next, I'll take you somewhere in the US. This is in Dallas, Texas. And this happens to be at the University of Texas at Dallas. We were asked to design a cultural master plan several years ago. It actually started out as one building and turned into a series of 4 buildings and a large arts plaza. So we have 2 museums that are contemporary art. We have a 700-seat performance hall and music building. We have a large 1,200-car parking garage, and then we have a massive cultural arts plaza that really starts to connect the entire institution and university together. And similar, as we all know, most of us have been on campuses, really the heart of universities, the heart of campus spaces are partly the buildings, but we would argue that more so are the outdoor spaces, really these kind of spaces in between, the pathways, the walkways, the open spaces, the places where really kind of life happens. And this happens to be at the University of Texas at Dallas and their main forum along their pedestrian mall. This is really the kind of place where people hang out. It's where life happens. It's where students study. There's beautiful weather there throughout most of the year. Of course, it does have bad weather sometimes, so we need to design for that. But ultimately, it was really the energy and the vitality of these exterior spaces that we were interested in starting to kind of take that energy and then adapt to. Where we're located, it's quite a large site. We're on the lower right where the red is. So we're really kind of at an edge, a gateway or a threshold. So it was important that not only do we represent the edge of the university itself in this kind of gateway, but then how do we connect back to everything that's happening up to the north? So really this idea of not only creating a destination, but then a kind of an interactive community as well. Really, this site is something that does not have a front or a back. It's really a site that's in the round. So we really needed to address that in all areas. And so the way that we did that really was starting to connect some of the pedestrian walkways and some of the pedestrian circulation paths of really kind of taking buildings to the edge and creating a kind of cultural heart, a plaza that's in the middle that can become a place for people to hang out, again, for students to study, for people to interact. And this being a cultural master plan itself for performance, for events, for music, for reading, for poetry, music, whatever that is, really the plaza was really kind of meant to be this connective tissue, not only between these cultural buildings, but then this larger connection back to the rest of the community. This is really kind of a conceptual approach to how we started to look at it from a larger perspective. This is really an understanding of how could we take the flow, the pedestrian flow, these kind of the energy of these in-between spaces, these external spaces from the campus, and start to pull those down into our site, and how those flow lines and those vector lines can really start to define some of the exterior spaces. How can they start to shape the architecture? How can they start to shape the spaces? And how can that then start to shape the architecture? So here we see on the left, we have 3, this kind of orange, purple, and light pink. These are the two museums and the performance hall. We start to see the arts plaza that's in the middle, and then the parking garage, and everything really has this kind of strong north-south, east-west axes to where it's very open, it's very connected. Each one of these buildings is really kind of 1 to 2 stories. They're very low. They fit into the rest of the building and the campus and the overall massing. But then there's really this very strong notion of bringing landscaping and plaza and open space into the overall master plan itself, and how each one of these starts to interact not only with each other and how these buildings have a dialogue with each other, but then they also have a dialogue with these exterior spaces and how each one of these buildings starts to actually shape these exterior spaces themselves. But then these exterior spaces start to not only pull people in as well. So one of the ideas, the strong ideas that we had to how to connect spaces together was lifting the buildings up. How can the buildings, how can they start to interact with and react to the environment? Dallas has some really great weather during most of the year, but then there's other times when it gets very hot. The sun is very hot. It can get rain, it can get ice storms, sometimes it can snow. So how do we create exterior spaces that can be used year round? Well, one of the ideas that we had here is how do we lift the buildings up? So essentially making the second floor larger than the first floor, which is essentially creating these kind of covered exterior spaces that are still part of the plaza, still part of the campus, but then can also start to take you inside and into the building. So this idea of kind of raising up on these pilotis, or these kind of raised dancing columns that we have here, really starts to kind of pull you into the building and really create these kind of exterior interior spaces that can really be used for campus life. And again, that really the kind of idea of this is an Athenaeum, and an Athenaeum is a really kind of strong idea that's been around for a very long time. And it's really meant to represent the notion of how can people really interact in many ways, again, whether it's music, poetry, performance, dance, etc. But how can the architecture and the exterior spaces start to connect back to the community? And so this notion of not only these interior spaces where functions are happening, how do we open that up to the community? How do we open that up to the campus to give you a sense of how these buildings can start to open up? And same with these museums, because it is less of fine artwork and more kind of object-based oriented. We really started to look at how we can maximize the amount of windows and the views to open up into the campus itself. So you start to see how the buildings are starting to unfold, and this happens to be our first phase, the Museum of Asian Art, currently under construction. These are fairly recent construction photos, and how it's starting to work here. You can see how these kind of dancing V columns are holding up the exterior spaces, how they're starting to really kind of create and shape these spaces using those kind of exterior spaces to create and shape the architecture, how the buildings are really starting to kind of represent and become these connective tissues and these spaces that really start to enhance and kind of connect back to the overall campus itself. Utilizing the kind of idea of precast concrete, white texture that reflects the Texas sun, something that reflects that, but then also becomes this beautiful textural kind of fabric that starts to wrap around the entire buildings and give it an identity. But then also in between these spaces, we have glass. And this glass is really important because it's really becoming this kind of negative space that allows you to really get a sense for what's happening inside and outside, and really starting to blur the boundaries between exterior and interior. And this whole notion of being on a campus and knowing that whether it's an exterior space or an interior space, you're always connected back to what's happening in the larger part of the campus, right? It's this whole notion of that kind of energy that we were trying to capture from the rest of the exterior spaces. And as these start to get finished here and slowly start to take shape, it's really started to become clear and evident that the kind of moves we're making of lifting the building up, about creating glass at the ground floor, is starting to become something that's reinforcing our notion, our intuition, that this connectivity, that these kind of quasi-interior, exterior spaces have really started to become successful. So something that we're looking forward to seeing as it starts to finish itself. Now I'm going to shift and take you to Asia and take you to Shenzhen, China. And this is a very different building typology. This is a high rise. This is a 350-meter high rise. And one of the questions may be, how can you connect a high-rise back to a community? How can you connect back to a city? Because oftentimes high-rises are just thought of simple volumes, but I think the kind of shifting notion or shifting idea is how can you really start to bring the energy of a city into a high-rise, not only at the ground floor, but then how can you do that up above as the upper floors as well? So our idea here was quite simple, was a detached core. So on the right, the vertical shiny piece, that is where all the core elements are. So we have some bathrooms, elevators, stairs, things like that. In the middle, we have a series of glass sky bridges that take you from the core and the elevators over into the left, which is the kind of open space where all of the offices are. Quite a simple idea, very effective. One where, of course, you look at the idea of what a traditional tower plan was, more of a donut scheme. So what we did is quite simply take the core out, detach that, connect the two with a series of these connecting bridges. And here you start to get this better sense of how the core and then how the bridges and these open spaces start to interact. So the idea of really how can a high-rise start to become part of a community other than just what's happening at the ground floor? How can we start to activate these upper floors? And so one of the ideas is really a series of these kind of glass bridges, right? And how these can start to become these strong connectors. So every time, every morning, every afternoon, no matter where it is, when you have to go up or down or connect back, you're constantly going through these glass sky bridges that allows you and gives you these kind of this sense of floating above the city, but then also connected back to the city itself. So this way of really reminding you and activating this notion that you are in the city, that you are a part of the city, and it gives you a different perspective of how the city itself functions and maybe give you a moment of pause. Maybe these are spaces where people can have informal meetings, more than just a transactional or transitional space, but maybe these kind of momentary interim spaces where people can really start to kind of like understand the life of the city and the building itself. So each one of these is very layered in terms of how it interacts and how they interact with each other. Again, this notion of not only a transitional space, but how can you step out and have a phone call? Can you step out and have an informal meeting? Whatever that is, it's really this idea that each one of these glass bridges and how they're relating to each other and relating to the space is really connecting back to that community, and how the void space in between becomes that overall kind of connective tissue, not only between the building itself, but then also how it's connecting back to the city. And as we get into the main floor space or the open space, what that does effectively is frees up the entire space to have these unobstructed views of looking out towards the city. So much more of a flexible open office space, but then giving you these kind of unobstructed views that are giving you this kind of open flexibility as well. And of course, as we drop back down to the ground with all high rises and all buildings, incredibly important how they hit the ground, how they connect to the ground. And so here, the idea was having a large shopping mall, a retail shopping complex that really starts to connect back to the city and the urban fabric. So how do we kind of pull the energy of the form and the shape back down, start to shape that and start to become this larger notion of connectivity? So really starting to help engage and invigorate this notion of kind of bringing people into this larger atrium space where a shopping mall, where you're again kind of connected back to the sky and connected back to the building that's above you. So now I'm going to take you to Europe. This is in Vigo, Spain. This is in the northwestern corner of Spain. It's just above Portugal. A tiny little port town, actually not so tiny, really great port town that, again, it was this idea of how do we take a large infrastructure project that's a train station, how do you turn that into something that becomes more about a community? How do you turn that into something that really becomes an integral part of the fabric itself? And so, of course, looking at traditional Italian or kind of modern Italian or Spanish plazas, and how do we take the notion of that and really start to transform that, having this large infrastructural project that becomes a massive part of the city, not only for infrastructure, for for transportation, but then also for a place for people to hang out. So the idea is that this is not only a train station itself, it has a series of train levels, but it also is a shopping mall, it's a retail complex. But this larger idea of using this roof, these usually have these infrastructure projects have very large roofs. And the idea here was, how do we start to use that kind of fifth elevation or that roofscape to then connect back to the city? And how does that really start to become a larger part of the community? And here you can start to see how dynamic this is, how dynamic the city is. There's amazing views looking out towards the port and the water. It's a very beautiful hillside town. So really the idea of activating this kind of fifth elevation was incredibly important to the overall kind of vitality and energy of the project itself. So quite simply, it's a train station down below, but as we start to come up to the main level, it's a very traditional layout for a shopping mall with a kind of racetrack approach and a series of atriums that are in the middle that take you up and down in between the different levels and to the roof. So very functional in terms of its layout on 2 levels. And then, of course, as we get to the roof, this is really where a lot of the activation happens. So not only from the first 2 levels of retail and shopping, but how do we start to pull people up and really make this the kind of heart or the attraction of the space? So this very kind of long, low connected space where it has a series of these moments that start to connect you vertically in between different spaces, and whether that's all the way down through where the train levels are or connecting all the way back up into the roof. There's a series of kind of understanding of how we connect vertically to these different levels and how they start to interact with each other. So this idea of a very kind of dynamic roofscape and something that can really start to connect back to the city itself and understanding the programming of it. What do we do up here? How do we do this? Do we create skate parks? Do we create fitness areas, tennis courts, basketball courts, different spaces, kids' playgrounds, different areas where really this can start to become a part of the community on a daily basis, and whether the building is open or whether it's closed, it starts to become a part of that kind of urban fabric. And so as we start to understand not only the scale and the relationship of what happens at the street level, the drop-off, the level and the scale of that, of how we start to pull people in, whether those are visitors or passengers, whether those are people that are coming to the shopping mall, or whether that's people that are just coming down from the city and want to hang out on the roof. It's really this kind of multi-dimensional, multi-layered building that's much, much more than just a piece of infrastructure. It's really how infrastructure can become an integral part of a community, become much, much more than that. And this, to us, was probably the most important in terms of how we activated this, how we programmed the building, how we used a series of connections and interactions and design moves to really make this something that is much more important to how it fits into the fabric of the city. So as you're looking down onto the roof itself, we have a series of pavilions that are here, plazas, some landscaped areas, different places for different ages for children to play. We have some small children play parks. We have a skate park. We have different courts and places where people can be active and work out. We have basketball courts. There's a series of skylights that look back down into the main concourse itself. And really, as the landscape and the trees start to grow in over time, this will really start to become a place that is really an integral part of the community and where it can start to be utilized at all different levels. So this whole notion of like being on a building, on a roof, but yet being in the city, but yet there's trains and transportation and then shopping and everything happening down below. So this really kind of multi-use complex that becomes much more than a train station. And as we start to get in, again, this idea of connectivity, this idea of porosity, this idea of openness, this idea of transparency, of, again, really kind of shaping space, shaping public space, shaping private space, and really making sure and ensuring that all these spaces somehow connect back to the city, right? By opening up, by utilizing different kind of moves with the architecture, with the structure, with the circulation, creating a series of these dynamic spaces that start to become multi-dimensional, multi-layered, visually connected, physically connected to each other, and really ensuring that the whole notion of architecture, space, city, and community are all interconnected with each other. And the last project I'll take you to, this is in Los Angeles, our hometown. This is very close to us in our office. This is Emerson College. Emerson College is actually originated in Boston. They have their main campus there, but they have had a satellite office in Los Angeles for a number of years. And they always have students come out for internship programs, but they had come to us and said they wanted to have a permanent home in Los Angeles on Sunset Strip in Hollywood. So a very iconic and dynamic site. And again, when people think of Los Angeles, of course, Los Angeles is quite a large city, just like Buenos Aires and many other cities, but there's something about the climate here. When people think of LA, they think of palm trees, they think of sun, they think of climate and like beautiful weather, and it's true. And so this is something that we really tried to capture the essence of within the building itself. Now, this is an educational building. This is something that essentially is a mini campus. So one of the ideas here was, how can we take dormitories, housing for students, how can we take office spaces, how can we take educational spaces, outdoor spaces, private public functions, all of that, and condense that into a very tight urban site that is located on Sunset Strip in Hollywood. So the idea here in plan and section, quite simply, you see off to the right, we have these two orange bars vertically. Those become the dormitories for the students. And then in the middle, we really start to have more of the kind of classroom functions and the public functions. And on the left, you see the plan and how that starts to look. It was really quite simply an exercise in how do we start to utilize the massing and create massing, so we have this kind of distinction between public and private. So it was really kind of this way of quite simply diagramming out how can these two start to kind of separate from each other. We can have privacy for people that are living in the dormitories on the left and the right side, but then we have public events and classrooms and things that are happening in the middle. And of course, then how do we take what is essentially a private campus and then also connect that back to Sunset Boulevard, Sunset Strip, and Hollywood itself? So this kind of multifunctional, multi-layered, quasi-public private building that really starts to and needs to connect to all different levels. So really this idea, again, of how can it become part of the community? How can this building be more than just a closed off campus? But then how can it be something that really starts to open up itself? So one of the things here, for example, we're looking at is one of the dormitory wings, right? So you start to see some of the walkways for where the students are. How do we start to utilize a facade that not only becomes a kind of privacy scrim, but then also something that starts to activate and become much more of a kind of public function? How do we start to take the idea of Emerson College, which is about film and TV? Some of the great TV directors and actors have graduated from this school. How do we start to infuse the idea of film and TV and events and performance spaces into that? And one of the ways here was really to start to create a lot of exterior open spaces, a lot of spaces for studying, for students to hang out, but then also spaces for performance as well. So having these private exterior spaces where the campus, staff, students, etc., can not only be kind of private and away from the hustle and bustle of the city, but yet how can they be connected back to the city as well? So this is one of the views that's opening up. And if we look straight down this axis where the stair is, you can see the Hollywood sign that's directly located here. And this was a nice serendipitous moment with our design where the kind of building opened up and really framed the views, not only of the building itself, but then of the Hollywood sign and the Hollywood Hills. So really kind of a nice moment when you start to think about how building, architecture, space, and city all start to culminate and come together and create these larger communities. This really kind of layered approach of, again, how can we create these exterior spaces that can be utilized not only, during the day, but in the evenings, but really start to take advantage of the climate that we have here in Los Angeles. How can we start to have spaces outside for classrooms, for teaching, for hanging out during the day? It's a really amazing climate to be in. Students want to be outside most of the time. They can practice out here. They can have their events. They can have community spaces. but then of course remind them that they're in this incredible community of Hollywood and they're connected back to this larger city. And so really something of how that architecture really starts to create that understanding and that awareness of the city that you're in and how that connects back. And so that really concludes. I hope that gives you a better understanding and insight into how we think about public spaces, how we think about cities, and how architecture can really start to become an integral part and a connective tissue of cities themselves, and how they can start to become a catalyst for growth, for urban growth, and become essentially an inspired space for how buildings and architecture and communities can all work together to become much greater spaces, and how cities can start to evolve more smartly as they start to grow. So thank you.
Thank you, Arne. That was fantastic to see all these projects, all this work. Thank you very much for your generosity of sharing this. Maybe I can have a couple of questions just to wrap it up and not to take you so many time. When you started the presentation, you said something about architects should think about a city and not only urbanists or big planning offices. So, in other words, what I understand is that you are encouraging architects to think more into what the buildings are doing into the city. What is the impact of the buildings in the city? So, what do you think makes the difference when architects thinks the city instead of I don't know, classic urbanists or people that understand the city as statistics or I don't know, Excel sheets?
Well, I think it's a good question, because I think, planning, landscape, architecture, these have been siloed approaches for so long. And I think oftentimes everyone gets stuck in their own lanes, if you will. They get very siloed in terms of how we're looking at just the building and the performance. There's, if you're just looking at city planning, of course, there's many, many things that need to be part of the overall kind of like public and urban fabric. But then oftentimes urbanists start to forget about buildings and how buildings can actually become opportunities for that. On the opposite side, architects oftentimes are so worried about what's happening in the building and making their clients happy and doing everything that needs to happen in terms of its pragmatics, its functionality, its cost, how it stands up, all these things. Landscape architects are focused sometimes on landscape only, and I'm generalizing, but I think really there's this hybrid approach where we as designers, as architects, as urbanists, as landscape architects, we really need to start thinking about cities and buildings holistically, and these environments, and starting to think about, as I was showing, how buildings themselves, how the massing, how the shaping, how the porosity, how these kind of public spaces and these interconnected spaces can actually start to become these strong catalysts for future growth, and how buildings really represent. Because, I mean, let's face it, none of us like to go into cities where you just have buildings that have solid facades. There's no scale, there's no hierarchy, there's no proportion. I mean, we look at places like, Las Ramblas or, Pacific Gracia in Barcelona. We look at Copenhagen. We look at Milan or Rome or Spain or Greece. You look at any cities, you look at South America or Asia. All these cities that we all love to go to and travel to, they all have one thing in common, is that it's architecture, it's open space, it's scale, height, proportion, it's landscaping. All of these things work together to create these very unique spaces. And those are these catalysts, I think, that we as designers and planners need to really start to utilize and understand of what we're really creating when we're kind of creating these master plans or these buildings in a vacuum. Really start to think outside the boundaries. And that's something that we always tend to do. Even if we're just given a building as a brief, we never, ever just think about the building itself. The first thing we do is we look at the master plan. We look at the city. We look at what's happening outside of our context. We look at cues within the urban environment to understand how can that start to shape the architecture. Like Emerson College, for example, understanding that we've got views looking all around to the Hollywood Hills, to downtown, to the Pacific Ocean, whatever that is. We understood that we needed to not only have a building that was porous, but then also it's on Sunset Strip. So it's on one of the most iconic cities, or on iconic streets in the US, if not in the world. So it's really looking at these urban cues as to how you can do that. So I think whether it's the planning side, the architecture side, I think both need to be much more aware that the moves they're making, the policies, the shaping, the spaces, whatever that is, it's constantly not only educating ourselves, but educating our clients, educating the city officials, whoever that is, making sure that we're thinking about it in a much more holistic way and try to reinforce the idea that buildings and cities are part of one and they coexist together.
And there's something about the scale too, because I think that the approach will be different. While you present the tower, I think that, I don't know, the higher you go, the more of the city you are affecting or you are impacting in a way. Are there different approaches for in this initial studies of the city regarding the scale of the building, I suppose?
Absolutely. I think it really depends. You know, you look at high rises now, I think there's a trend, and rightfully so, and this isn't new by any means. This was started even, you know, look at some of the earlier architects like Norman Foster, you know, looking at like the bank in Frankfurt, for example, but like, you know, how towers can really start to become a part of their fabric and their community itself. So how they can start to break apart and how they can start to become much more open and porous and how they can connect back to the community as well. So I think it has a lot to do with scale, but I think it's really incumbent upon not only the planners, when you're looking at density and height, understanding how architects can utilize these basic requirements of massing, of shaping, of setbacks, and what gives them, how can you, as a planner, how can you give architects the tools and the opportunities to start to be creative with shaping form and space, and vice versa, then how can we as architects start to become creative with how we're utilizing these spaces as well. But it's really kind of massing and shaping and height and setbacks. And there are some cities that understand that. New York understands that. Sydney understands that. There's certain European cities that understand how zoning, massing, heights, setbacks can really start to enhance qualities of cities, whether that's natural light. I mean, look at Paris, for example, right? Or look at London. You know, those are cities that really understand the quality of life at the ground level and how the architecture and the massing up above can start to enhance that. Right? We start to look at New York City, that's different, right? The ground plane is amazing, it's dynamic, but it's also very concentrated. It has a very different look and feel with a lot of the buildings that are around that. So there's kind of different qualities, but it's something where the massing and the shaping really plays a very important role on really what's happening at the ground level.
Well, you talked about the chance to think about the open space as important as interior space. So in a sense, there is a thinking about the negative space of the building. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about the process of thinking on this relationship between inside and the outside, and how are they being articulated from project to project?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, this is something that, you know, Thom in the office, this approach has been integral to almost every single project, even starting way back. And that's why I showed Diamond Ranch High School. You know, this was a high school that was one of the first big projects in the office. You know, it was located in Los Angeles, so the ability to take advantage of the climate and the weather here. But the buildings themselves were important, but also the exterior spaces were almost even more important. And how can those spaces in between start to become the kind of heart of the space? And so I think this idea and this approach of no matter what project it is, because every building we work on is quite different. It's very unique, whether it's in its context, location, its program, its typology, whatever that is. But we always have the same question. How can this building connect back to the community? And that's where the thinking and the creativity comes in. Oftentimes we don't know. Or the building in Dallas, the one that lifts itself up, right? Where the ground floor is smaller and the second floor is larger. So this idea of how do we just create a larger ground floor where the space down below it's not unused space. It actually becomes space that can be used. And it was quite a kind of a brilliant move because the client loved it, because like I said, it gets hot in Dallas. They get very hot weather. The sun is very hot, or it gets cold and rain during the winter and the months. So these kind of exterior spaces that are part of the fabric of the campus, but yet still covered. Or vice versa, in Orange County, the Orange County Museum of Art, again in Southern California, where we have this rooftop park and sculptural garden that can become a part of that. So it really it's dependent upon each building and each typology, but it's something that we're always thinking of, again, of like, how can the building start to become that? So no matter what that is, I think this is where the kind of creativity and the interrogation of how we design, and that's just part of who we are in our process. It's something that we're always thinking of. And oftentimes we're educating our clients. Clients don't always think about this, but this is what we bring to the table, is our thinking and our understanding of cities and how that grows. And usually when we start talking to our clients about this, then they start to understand, oh yeah, this is important. It's important that my building and our building become a larger part of the integral fabric.
That's amazing. So, okay, just maybe one more question regarding style. I'm always amused of how Morphosis had this ability to keep being faithful to a singular style, that you can recognize the buildings, but at the same time, there's always something new that they bring to the discussion. So my question is, how do you manage as such a big office, working so many projects all around the world, to keep working on I don't want to say a similar line, but in a language that is in a sense recognizable?
Well, that's a good question. We definitely don't start to design in a certain style per se, but what I think is consistent in the work is the approach. We're always asking a series of the same questions of, again, how can this be part of a city? How can it connect back to the fabric? But then also, I think a lot of it comes from curiosity and asking questions of how can we design a building that's of a place, of a time, of a certain moment that can only exist within that? And what I mean by that is saying, how can we take the constraints and the parameters of a project, whether that's a site, whether that's a high-rise in Shenzhen, whether that's the line in Saudi Arabia, whether that's a project in Milan, whatever that is, how can we take the constraints of that, the program, the brief, the typology, the city, the weather, the region, the context, how can we take all of those constraints and how can we turn those into design opportunities to create something that is unique? So I would say that we're always asking the same questions. We're always starting with a kind of broad notion of understanding the kind of larger context of things. And then I think it comes down to how we synthesize those, how we work with the clients, how we work with ourselves, our internal process. And then I think it comes down also to this curiosity of wanting to innovate, not necessarily wanting to be stuck in a certain style per se. So yes, there is a kind of sculptural idea of a kind of thread of how our buildings look, but each one of them is very different. I mean, in Orange County, we use terracotta. At UT Dallas, we use precast. We glass, or the colored stainless steel in Milan, or in Vigo, it's kind of just more of like an urban park. So we don't want to hold ourselves to a certain kind of style or language, but I think oftentimes we're informed by the city. And a lot of times those cues that we get from the city, or like I was talking, how buildings can start to become connected between interior and exterior. So it's a series of these moves, I think, that we want to make, and ultimately creating spaces that are interesting, that are functional, that are pragmatic, but then also poetic. Right? I think we're interested in creating spaces that are poetic, and spaces that are memorable, and spaces that are inspiring.
That's fantastic. Well, on that note, I think we can wrap it up. So Thank you very much, Arne, for doing this. Maybe you have now the chance to say anything that maybe you wanted to say, something that slips in the presentation. You're welcome, and thank you again for doing this. It's such a pleasure for me. I'm a big fan of The Office, Thom, for a long time, so it's very great to see what The Office is working on today. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, great. Well, listen, all I want to say, I think I've said enough, so I just want to say thank you again. It was really a pleasure. I love talking about our work. I hope it's exciting and inspiring for people and gets people excited about what we all do every day as creatives and as designers, and, you know, inspires people to go out and do their best work, and, you know, and appreciate your love for The Office, and, you know, can't say thank you enough. So I appreciate it, and I hope this is well received, and yeah, so thank you so much.